Hello and welcome back to the Right Brain Podcast. Today we're gonna talk about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, as some
ACEs.
people call it.
Right. Not the kind in the cards, deck of cards, but
Thank God you cleared that up.
yes. ACEs. Hugely important thing that, again, probably nobody's ever heard of before.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked before about that almost all adult mental health issues really come down to looking at childhood brain development.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we had talked about that there are different things that can affect brain development. And we talked about looking at retained primitive reflexes as a marker of that.
Yeah.
But we also know that any sort of abuse or neglect or things like that affect people's mental health.
Yeah. Like in the most recent episode we talk about, I guess, kind of like the scientific side of everything, but then it's also, now this is the emotional side of things and how both of them coincide.
Because most people think, when you think of an adult mental health issue or childhood, we think that, we hear over and over, and you go back to like Freud's work and everything about how it's all about your mom and dad, or, your, trauma or abuse that you had as a kid, or if you had a screwed up childhood. And so we look at it as, well, that's psychological. And that's the reason for adult mental health issues if it starts in childhood, or something like that may happen later on in life. But it's actually a lot more complicated and intricate. And there is the different things that can happen in childhood, although they may be somewhat emotional and psychological, they have a physical impact on the brain. And that's something that nobody really understood until several years ago, with the studies around these things called adverse childhood experiences.
Okay. So you said that there's like 10 different ones, right?
Yeah, so let's give you kind of the history of this. So the research that's been done on this is some of the best research that's ever been out there. So, this is really well documented. That's why you'll see a quote later. We have a couple of graphics where a guy who was head of the American Pediatric was talking about that this may be one of the biggest, health crises that people have never heard about. But it's really, there's big studies on it. So what happened was, around the 80s, late 80s, a huge health organization called Kaiser Permanente, which is the main health organization in California, they wanted to do something around obesity. They were seeing that obesity was on the rise, and they wanted to do things. So they were taking certain people, and they were giving them all this education and training them on eating better and exercise and things like that. And they found that people were doing well, but for no reason, about 50% of people, and almost all the people that were actually doing really well, eventually quit and stopped. And they were like, why would that be? Why are these people, just when they're doing this and it's successful? And so they started to delve into some other reasons, and they wanted to find if there was some correlating factor. So they went through like 26,000, 27,000 files of all of these people, and they wanted to look and see, was there anything about them that stood out? And what they found was that there were these 10 different childhood experiences that they had that related to these people. And they ended up identifying and calling them adverse childhood experiences.
Okay.
And so there were 10 of them that they identified. So if we put up the first graphic there. And so they really obviously fall around the idea of abuse and neglect. So
just read them out loud in case people are just listening on.
Emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse was 3. Then there was domestic violence, substance abuse in the family, mental illness in the family, parental separation or divorce, or an incarcerating parent. And then there was also neglect, so emotional and physical neglect. So those were the 10 things that they found. Of course, there were others, but when they looked at the large group, these were the ones that were most consistently affected. And they found that, so they started looking at this and started looking at the correlation between this and not just obesity, but they started looking at it through all of these other physical and mental health issues. And what they found was that, they did this large study, and in the study, I think something like 70% of the people in the study were college educated. So this wasn't in, let's say, communities that were really, underprivileged or underserved or something like that. This was in a fairly, average population. And they found that, surprisingly, if we go to the next graphic, that almost 70% of people in this group had at least one of these in their childhood history. They found that around 12%, or about 1/8, had at least 4 or more. And if you had 4 or more, you had anywhere from a 400 to 1,200% increase in the risk of all of these other health-related issues. And not just mental health, but actually all these chronic physical health issues like, heart disease and diabetes. And, there was a 14 times increased chance of suicide, but also depression and liver disease, cancer. And so they looked at this and they were like, wow, okay. And in those that had 4 or more, or especially 6 or more, they died 20 years earlier on average.
That's so crazy.
So
wow.
It was like, wait a second. Okay, we would expect that if somebody was neglected or abused, that they might have some mental health issue, right? You'd expect that they, may suffer from depression or anxiety. But why are they having cardiovascular disease or cancer or liver disease? So the thinking initially was, well, these people had been abused or neglected or suffered some issues. So they just had bad behavior. They themselves became alcoholics, or they drank more, or they smoked more, or they were more, they took more drugs, or they had more, more sex with different partners. And when they really analyzed the group, they found that no, their behavior wasn't any different than anybody out there. So it wasn't risky behavior that was causing these health issues. There was something else.
Yeah.
And they didn't understand what that was because, again, the shock was that it was, the reason why, or it had a direct relationship to why these people were obese and couldn't get and wouldn't get themselves better, or why they had cardiovascular disease, and so when they started looking again at what's the root cause here, like what is actually happening, which is obviously what we've talked about and what I'm all about. So what we have up here is like a pyramid. You had mentioned it. And the pyramid is they're looking at, okay, what's the root cause? So at the base are these adverse childhood experiences. And they were saying, what did adverse childhood experiences do that could have led to them having not only mental health issues, but physical health issues and dying 20 years earlier? And what it turns out is that on the bottom right above it, it says disrupted neurodevelopment. Wow. So what these adverse childhood experiences did is it altered brain development early on. And what they showed was that it really caused this activation of what we call the sympathetic nervous system, or the fight or flight, or what we call this HPA axis system. that was their speculation, that they saw that there were changes in the autonomic system where there was this increased fight or flight response, and that created increases in stress hormones and created, ultimately that's what had the physical, or had part of the physical impact on the body, on the immune system, and all of that. So I've talked about that a lot. And actually, we wrote a paper on this in 2009 in relationship to autism, on, again, because when you look at it, ADHD, autism, dyslexia, learning disabilities, processing disorders, OCD, Tourette's, tics, and to me, anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, they're all neurodevelopmental disorders.
Yeah.
They're all caused by disrupted neurodevelopment. They're all caused by that. But, most of the population did not suffer from this, okay? We said that 70% have maybe at least one, but only about 12% of the population had 4 or more. And so, we see, though, that a large percent of the population has these other issues. We're dealing with, probably maybe at least 20, 25, 30% at least of the population has some sort of probably neurodevelopmental or mental health issue. So, it's probably even more than that because a lot of that is underdiagnosed. So when you look at this and you look at brain development, it goes back to what we were talking about and correlating this all from a neurological perspective. So the bottom line is that not only the mental health, but the physical health issues that happen, even with abuse and neglect or, really difficult childhood, is that it physically alters brain development. So the answer is not just talk therapy, meaning talk therapy doesn't change brain function. Not really. It has a little bit of an impact, but it doesn't go back and look at the root cause. It doesn't go back to the foundational problem. And as is that analogy we used last time when we talked about, the foundation needs to be solid, or you're going to have talk therapy is one of those top-down therapies,
Right. Yeah.
along with behavioral intervention and academic interventions that have some benefit, but they don't deal with the root cause.
Right.
They don't deal with the foundational issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so it's kind of interesting because, for those of you, if you're just listening to this episode, we're talking about obviously traumatic experiences that affect people emotionally deeply. But then the primitive reflexes that we were talking about, my dad explained that like by 1 year old, you should have like all of these like physical reflexes that help you when you're a baby, like, and they should be gone by then. But it's interesting because I'm like wondering if the trauma makes those physical reflexes not go away, or if those it's so interesting how they're kind of like intercorrelated, which is also why he's saying talk therapy, of course, is helpful.
Yes.
But there are these like actual physical things in your body that get retained that need to be worked out as well.
Exactly. So what I talk about is the optimal approach is really a bottom-up therapy that deals with the root cause, and a top-down therapy together. So like I work with a lot of psychologists or trauma therapists, because obviously if you have psychological trauma and if you had problems with your parents, you need to deal with that. You need to work with a trauma therapist that can help you. But the root cause of it really goes down to that brain development was changed. And so when we talk about this, the next stage, we talked about this with the primitive reflexes, but is what we said, there's a lot of things that we can talk about. So the next step of this is we said that primitive reflexes come from this bottom part of the brainstem. And we said that's what's active first when we're born. And these reflexes need to go away. And that means that the brainstem has matured. And then what's built on top of it. But also, equally or maybe even more important, there are all these other things happening in that same part of the brainstem where the reflexes come from. And as they're going away and as that bottom part of the brainstem is maturing, there are other nuclei that need to mature and develop a potential a balance there. And that is between what we call the sympathetic and parasympathetic nuclei.
Okay.
And the foundational nuclei that regulate the balance of those two is in that same area of the brainstem. When we're born, our sympathetic fight or flight is on high alert. It's there. That's the way we're born. That's the way it's supposed to be. And there's one nuclei in the brainstem that's there, and it's on when the reflexes are there. And that's kind of related to that Moreau reflex we talked about. The Moreau
Moreau reflex is when you could explain it, yeah.
Yeah, that's that startle response.
Yeah, like you clap your hands behind somebody, and if they freak out, then don't do it. But if you want to see if they have a Monroe reflex.
Or if you just jump whenever you hear like a loud noise or something really easily. So as that goes away, the sympathetic response should go down, and it should be replaced by the parasympathetic, which is called the rest and digest. So when we look at the sympathetic is the fight or flight. So that is there in our nervous system primarily to signal when we're in danger. So when you're in danger, when you're scared, what happens? What's some of the things that happen in your body?
My heart beats really fast.
Your heartbeat's going to go real fast.
My hands get shaky.
Right. You may start sweating.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I got real sweaty.
Pupils get big. Your hearing gets more hypersensitive.
Yes. Oh, my gosh. Yeah.
Right? And you might even like crouch down and change your physical posture.
Oh, my God. I have chills now. Yeah.
Right.
I'm not even scared of anything.
And so what also happens is it shuts down your digestive system because we're taking blood from your gut to move it into your arms and legs to run or fight. So that's how we're born. We're literally born in this state, like ready to fight, okay? And there's a nuclei that regulates that in an area called the medulla, and that's there, and that's supposed to happen. But then as we develop in this first year, and as we talked about, as these reflexes come on, and as they lead us through these different stages, like rolling over, crawling, sitting up, pulling up, standing, walking. As we go through these steps and these reflexes come on and then they need to go away, at one, they should all be gone. And at that point, what should happen is during that period, as that's happening, and as our brainstem is maturing, another nucleus, the parasympathetic, or most people understand it as the vagal system or the vagus nerve system, that should be coming on. And as that comes on, that is inhibiting that sympathetic nucleus, that fight or flight. And so when a baby's born, their heart rate is really rapid. It's like 130, 140. In a normal adult, it's between, let's say, 60 and 80. So it slows down as our brain matures because as our brain matures, our parasympathetic system comes on. Okay.
But so you're saying, okay, there's a lot of questions I have here. But yeah, so what you're saying is like you're in your sympathetic nervous system, and that's when you're in fight or flight, and like it messes with your digestive system and everything like that. Then you go to your parasympathetic because you're like chilling out. But if adverse childhood experiences happen, that makes you remain in fight or flight, which can give you all these chronic health issues, like digestive issues. I don't know. Am I making sense?
Yes. And more than that, adverse childhood experiences have an impact on maturity of the brainstem. And so they may interfere with these reflexes going away. And that also interferes with the development of the vagus nerve or the parasympathetic nervous system and getting you out of a fight or flight state, which you're only supposed to be in, for really more the first few months of your life. But if the reflexes don't go away and the parasympathetic doesn't come on, you're in this chronic fight or flight state your whole life. And over time, that's really toxic to your body. And that is what causes all of these early chronic illnesses and ultimately why people die early.
This is so crazy. This is so much to think about. I don't know if this has to do with this necessarily, but it's just making me think about it because you brought up how like talk therapy is like bottom down and then you need to like work
Top down.
whatever, top down. And then you need to like
You're
work.
not good with directions.
I'm not.
Right, left, up,
They know this. Everyone knows I don't know my left from my right. It's very
or up from down.
Charming. But so anyway, like the first time I ever saw some sort of therapy that wasn't like that was when I was in acting school and we had a movement teacher. Remember I told you about this?
Yeah. She did that seminar with us. What was her name?
Yes, Julia.
Yeah, she was great.
Yeah, she was great. Okay, yes, she came. Yeah, my dad brought her in to do a seminar, but I don't know how this relates to this, and if it doesn't, then you can tell me. But when I was in school, like we had a movement teacher, we had to take these movement classes, and everyone got a role where maybe they were in like conflict. So like, let's say I'm like. In the role that I had, I'm like yelling at my husband for like cheating at me. But first you do the role first with like without Julia there. So you're just acting in front of the whole class. And I guess from their analysis of my like behavior of my body, like even though I was like saying the words and yelling at my husband, I was like actually backing away from him and saying it in kind of like a scared type of way. And I guess that was me like protecting myself. And then when I did it again, she was like, I noticed where you hold your trauma or where you hold like your emotion is like in your neck. So like that's why I was like kind of crouching down and whatever. So this time I like when I went to yell at him, she like held my neck and pulled it up as I was saying it. And I started hysterically crying. And it happened for every single person in the class, which I'm assuming for the most part, everyone in the class was a very right brain person because that's why we're all in acting class and kind of, striving to do all of that. But anyway, she explained it. She was like, yeah, she's like, I'm 5'11". And when I was a kid, I got made fun of for being really tall. So I would like crouch my chest and whatever, and that would be the way I protected myself anytime I was in a conflict situation. And she was like, so when someone starts to expose that and you get into conflict and now you're in a position that's not your protector anymore, like you revert back to like your 13-year-old self when she was getting made fun of. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but I just thought it was really interesting because I never seen anything in my life where every single person, grown men, whatever, the second she like exposed the part of their body that they've always protected or used as their protector, some people fell on their face. It was crazy to watch.
And your mom said the same thing when she took a similar course, right?
Yeah.
I remember when we first got married and your mom was taking acting in New York, she came home saying the same thing, like this movement therapy. And that kind of triggered a lot of my thoughts at the time about that. But so I might look at it a little bit differently, meaning that let's say there were some retained reflexes. And so reflexes, the thing about them is they're these pattern program movements.
Yeah.
And so, subconsciously, your body is adopting certain postures based on these reflexes. And if they don't go away, then you may constantly be reactivating these pattern program movements in your body subconsciously that you don't know you're doing it. Now, what happens is that in, a lot of therapies, because they don't really understand this and understand these reflexes, and you have to look at the foundation of where movement comes from, is that then they come up with a psychological reason as to why you do it.
Okay.
Right? So they'll say, because of traumas you've had. Well, obviously I was there for your whole childhood. You had a really happy, great childhood. It wasn't like you.
No,
I'm
not saying that. But we don't have to. Also, whatever.
No, but what I'm saying is that it's although we all have certain traumatic events or things that happen to us. She was coming up, well, because I was 5'11" and because I got made fun of, this is why I did it and this I had it. Or it could be that these reflexes are there and that she was tall and it made her hunch over and that people also did make fun of her. And so she's correlating one with the other when the root cause of it may have been really that this reflex didn't go away fully. And that may be related to that. But what that's doing is that's hardwired into your nervous system to the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And so therefore, if you trigger that or do something with that or alter it, it changes that, which then changes your emotions and changes the foundation of your emotions in something called your limbic system, which is really kind of that foundational core of your brain where all your emotions kind of initially come from.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you're giving more of like that makes it make a lot more sense that
Right.
it's like.
But now with the ACES study, we're saying that maybe it could also work the other way around, meaning that maybe these traumatic events or maybe being made fun of would have caused her reflexes to be retained. The only thing is these reflexes should be gone when you're one.
Yeah, when you're one. Yeah.
So that's way before any of that sort of trauma would have happened.
Right.
And usually that level of psychological trauma isn't going to bring the reflexes back, most likely. But the important thing there that you're talking about is that relationship between movement and how you may chronically move your body in a certain way that is protective, and that's what the sympathetic nervous system does. The sympathetic makes us go into this protective stance. It makes you kind of come in and close your chest in a little bit and protect your heart and, maybe move your head forward and, tilt your head down. And that may lead to things like chronic neck pain or back pain or chest pain or, bad posture or things of that nature.
So why do you think, because obviously all of those, can we pull it back up? Because I just want to see the 10 that are, the other one. Yeah, this one. Okay. So the 10 that he was saying are, again, domestic violence, substance abuse, mental illness, parental separation or divorce, incarcerated, sorry, can't read, incarcerated parent, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, and physical neglect.
Right.
So, obviously we all know these are all traumatic things for kids to go through, but it's like, I'm trying to understand just because it causes so much stress in the child.
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly because they didn't study from that standpoint. They did, but what they were saying is that how it correlated with the chronic illnesses and early death, as well as the mental health issues, had to do with the fact that it altered this autonomic system, or that they were in this chronic fight or flight state.
Right.
But that literally was
changing their brain.
That literally this altered normal neurodevelopment. Now, again, in this study and everything, they didn't really, again, a lot of the understanding of what we've talked about of what constitutes normal neural development wasn't even known, right? A lot of that is stuff that, honestly, I've written a lot about. As far as the real intricacies of how the brain develops and how this could work. They really didn't relate it to that because obviously they're not looking at things like early milestones and not looking at primitive reflexes and not looking at, motor development or how they're just looking at there's this correlation between this chronic illnesses and that these people have this chronic fight or flight state and that has something to do with maturity of the brain. And we know that people that are subject to abuse and neglect, that they have this alteration in their brain. Their brain literally is physically altered. And not only are they psychologically altered, but there's a relationship between the two.
But there's always hope here.
There's a lot of hope. This is the point of this.
So that's the point of us talking about all of this is that I know so many people have trauma. As we were saying, 1 in 8 of the population that they tested had more than 4+ of all of these things. So it's a common thing. But that is why we have this podcast, because he can explain that you can help yourself with these things and reverse it.
Absolutely. And the one thing that's been shown to be protective, right? Because as we talked about, only not everyone that's exposed to trauma ends up with this. So what about, because we're talking about 12% of the population had 4 or more, and that ended up with these issues. What about, the other percentage of people that were exposed to these things but don't end up with chronic illnesses? Because there also are many people that have been abused or neglected or been through this and don't end up with chronic illnesses or don't end up with mental health issues and end up being successful in life. So what's the difference? So one of the things I would say is that they may have not, it didn't alter their brain development. So somehow they were able to get rid of their primitive reflexes and they were able to go through normal brain development. But also there's something called resilience. And they know that, like when I do the screening with most of my adult patients, they fill out an ACES score for me. That's part of their history form. And then I also, on a large percentage of them, will have them fill out a resiliency score. So this is a series of questions that goes through and you mark off whether you've had any of these 10 things or how many you've had. And then there's a score that it's a series of questions that ask you basically how you react to certain things or how you deal with certain things. And what we know is that if you score really high on the resiliency score, even if you score really high on the ACES score, you don't have the same impact.
Oh, okay.
And so resiliency is also a byproduct of the brain, especially the right brain. And this has to do, again, with emotional regulation and attachment and the way the right brain, and a lot of the right brain is more parasympathetic in general. But too much of that or too little, like, so if you're too emotional, like we talk about, where the right brain is too strong and you're too emotional and you have too much sometimes of that, then also if you have a right brain developmental delay and you have too little parasympathetic, either one of those can lead to too much sympathetic. So whether you have a right brain or left brain deficit. So you either one of them, you can be in this state of fight or flight and have a trouble with emotional regulation.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But resilience lives in that right brain, and it lives in that kind of balanced right brain.
I've never heard of resilience being like described as like a brain function.
It's
I
an
just thought it
actual
was just
measurement.
like where I'm like, wow, that person's so resilient. I didn't know it was like an actual.
It's actually it's an actual scientific and neurological term, resilience, and we know that can be built later on in life. But the way that resilience is typically built in children is to allowing them to experience some difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you understand?
Yeah,
So
that makes sense.
this is the balance here, because too much trauma obviously affects brain development and can cause long-term issues in health and mental and physical health. But having challenges and having to overcome challenges is also what builds resiliency. And resiliency is your protection against the effects of trauma.
Wow. Okay.
So this is why one of the things, and again, I'm just, I'm talking from a scientific perspective. I don't mean to offend people in any way or anything. But there's a big movement now for super gentle parenting. Like, you don't yell at the child at all. You don't correct them.
Yeah.
So a child does something or, can even throw something at you or hit you or do something, and you're supposed to not yell at them or not ever, say anything in a harsh way or anything. And although I understand it, and I'm sure there's some benefits in that, but the problem is that I think you're not going to build resilience, because the idea is, I think what's happening with this movement is we're making everything so easy for the child that we're always accommodating them. Whatever they want to do, whatever they feel, it's all okay. It's all, they can do whatever they want, whenever they want.
Yeah, and that's not how it's going to work if they don't know how other people are.
That's not life.
Yeah,
right.
Everyone else in your life isn't going to be that nice to you the way that you're.
Right.
I mean, hopefully people are nice to you, but they're not going to be like, completely just following your lead all the time.
What builds resiliency is, in a controlled, loving way, making your child step outside of their comfort zone, making them do things that they naturally wouldn't want to do. That's the life. And that's how we build resilience. And that's also, if you look at resilience as the opposite of ACEs, then building resilience is building neurodevelopment, is helping the brain to develop in its most optimal way. Mm-hmm. Where ACEs, adverse experiences, trauma, disrupts neurodevelopment. The opposite of that is giving more, not traumatic experiences, but difficult experiences in a controlled, safe setting, actually builds the brain.
And then no matter how high they score on the ACEs, if they score high on the resilience, they're good to go.
Yes.
But if people are suffering from these like health issues and all, and that maybe they're listening and they're like, oh, I went through all of those things, and I don't want them to feel like, like obviously some of these statistics are a little daunting. So what would you suggest as like just some first steps to?
Well, the first thing is obviously you need to deal with these chronic issues. And so like if somebody, with most of these things, I think the best way to deal with it is through looking at diet, nutrition, and exercise. As we talked about, the single most important thing, on the airport on the way here, I picked up a Scientific American this month. And right on the talk of it, it says exercise cure. That the cure for everything now seems to be exercise. Why? Because it all comes down to movement. If you want to change the brain in a positive way, start moving in a positive way. It's kind of like your description. Through movement therapy, adopting a more powerful posture. And so I can look at it with my background in chiropractic and say, why would changing your posture make you feel better or do things? Because you're changing your spine, you're changing the foundational structure, and one of the most single important neurological structures, which is your spine and your posture. And that alters the way that your brain is going to fire more than anything else. 95% of most of your ongoing brain activity really comes from your spine and your spinal muscles, and especially in humans because we stand upright. But physically moving and exercising is in a healthy way, and building strength and core stability and posture and balance is foundational. And then that alters your autonomic system and the way you're going to digest and the way your immune system is going to regulate, and the balance of inflammation and anti-inflammation. But then the diet that you eat, if you have food sensitivities, you may need to eliminate them for a while. Vitamins, supplements, minerals, amino acids, avoiding toxins, avoiding all the crap food that's out there, being aware of toxins, because when you're in this fight or flight state, you're not detoxifying well, you're in a more inflamed state, you're more going to react to foods. So working with all of that is really important. And understand that medication doesn't really do any of that, right? Mm-hmm. Medication is helpful for managing the symptoms. If you have inflammation and you want to manage the inflammation, you can take an anti-inflammatory, but it doesn't deal with
But that's top down.
Right.
And we're trying to
not
start
dealing
from the
with
bottom
the cause.
Of the pyramid.
Right. It's not dealing with what may be the inflammation. You may be reacting to a food, or you may be, what's the actual trigger that may be there. Maybe something in your, phthalates in your makeup that might
I
be
was going to say
triggering.
that. That's probably in your phthalates in your makeup. So,
Yes. But so, understanding that you need to do things physically, diet, nutrition, exercise. Why are we seeing such a rise of all of these things? Because really in the past 30 years, we've stopped moving. Children don't move like they used to move. We're all around computers and technology now. And so the number one thing you can do is start moving more, exercising more, strengthen your body, start looking at your lifestyle, because all of these are driven by lifestyle more than anything else. And so change your lifestyle, change it in a positive way. But we've also talked about that some people, like if you're in a very depressed state or an anxious state, you can't just do that. It's not like you can just turn a switch and go, I'm going to do it.
right.
And that's where you may need to reach out to somebody, especially who's familiar with what I'm talking about, like my work, that can really change brain function in a way and really guide you through that. Identify if you have things like retained reflexes or if you have imbalances in your brain, in your nervous system, and in your body, and can really analyze your blood and look at lab testing and identify food sensitivities, because, eliminating gluten and dairy isn't for everybody at all. We do blood tests that identify, we get people that have 20 to 50 different food sensitivities, and they may not have dairy and gluten. So, you need to work with a professional, I think, that can help you. If you've been through trauma and abuse, then you may need someone that really focuses on trauma or doing trauma therapy, along with somebody that can physically go back and really heal whatever disrupted your neural development of the brain.
Okay. That's pretty okay.
Yeah, and
Pretty
as you said, in my book, Disconnected Kids, people can read a lot of this stuff, whether it's in your own child or whether you think of it as reading a book that's about your own inner child. You may go back and realize that, okay, and there's these checklists that people can fill out and you can just go online and look up adverse childhood experiences. And if you look under, an ACES checklist, you can fill out a checklist.
Yeah.
And you can look at it. And then there's also a resiliency checklist you can get, and you can fill those things out, and you can get a window into, if you're at risk of these issues and if you have a lot of them, but if you also developed your own resilience or against this, which if you did, great for you that you did that. You should feel very proud. But if not, you can build resilience.
Yeah. And I don't know, maybe hopefully it'll help people kind of let go of some shame, because like if you have chronic health issues and you went through all this trauma when you were a kid, like maybe it's not so much your fault as much as something you should just now that you're aware of it, have a better understanding of how to approach it.
Well, that's one of the biggest things we know with children is that they tend to suffer with a lot of shame and guilt their whole life because they feel like they're to blame, like that they did something that brought the abuse on them. And because your brain is still in an immature state and there's this subconscious child that's, even though intellectually as an adult you can say, one of my favorite scenes in any movie that relates kind of to this and relates to attachment disorders, because attachment disorders that we talked about are directly tied to this, right?
100%.
Is if you've seen the movie Good Will Hunting
Mm-hmm.
with Robin Williams and Matt Damon,
Mm-hmm.
and there's this scene near the end, and it's like their final meeting, and Robin Williams has his file in his hand, and he's there seeing Robin Williams because it was court ordered that he had to go there to get, so that he didn't go to jail because he got into a fight.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was there, and he says, Robin says, I'm getting this ready for, to submit it to court, to let them know that. And so Matt Damon says to him, that's my file there. And he said, yeah. And he said, that's not what's in that isn't very good. And Robin Williams says, no, this is pretty tough stuff that's in there. And he says, and what does it say? Stuff like, that I have an attachment disorder, or that I have self-sabotage, and he says to him, do you want to see your file? And he said, no. And then there's this point where, he opens it up and you see all these pictures of him as a child with bruises. And then they start talking about it. And Robin Williams talks about how he was an abused child and what his father would do. And he was drunk and abusive and physically. And then Matt Damon was talking about what his father would do. And so Robin Williams at one point comes up to him and says, it's not your fault. It's really an emotional scene. And Matt Damon goes, yeah, I know it's not my fault. And he says, not your fault. And he goes, I know. It's not your fault. I know. Not your fault. I know. And he gets more, he just keeps on repeating that. And Matt Damon, after a while, starts getting really agitated. And his emotions start coming up. And then there's a point where he kind of explodes and is going to fight him. And he basically says, don't do this. Don't. And then after that, he breaks and he starts crying and he breaks down and they hug. And what's really interesting, because if you look at a lot of trauma therapy and therapy, even going back to, what Freud talked about and Carl Jung talked about, is making the subconscious conscious. Basically, as a child, it's in that subconscious and it's there and it's always in there in you. But when you bring it conscious, you can heal it, that trauma, because now you're really taking it from the right brain where it lives in the subconscious into the left brain where the intellect and the conscious. So we talked about the id and the ego thing, right? Mm-hmm. Where all of a sudden your conscious can grab a hold of it and your adult can say to your inner child, it really wasn't your fault.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's an emotional thing, but if you watch that scene and you watch it from that perspective, it's amazing because, again, what there's so many people out there suffering with this.
Yeah, that's why, we were saying, talk therapy is a beautiful thing to do, especially when, people like that who know what they're doing and know how to bring the subconscious conscious, but then it's all the result of how you're physically in pain also is right. Something that you can address, so you don't have to be in that pain anymore in the chronic illness. So it's just, the
point is there's a physical underlying mechanism, and if you combine the physical with the mental approach, you're going to get even better. And a lot of the physical stuff you can do on your own through just really altering your lifestyle and being healthy, or seeking out somebody that can do things and work with your movement, or a movement therapist or a chiropractor or somebody who's trained in primitive reflex integration and functional medicine and functional neurology. There's so many people out there that can help you.
Yeah. Wow, guys. Okay. Yeah, hopefully, if you're listening to this episode, I would say it's just listening to the one that we did about primitive reflexes, because it will kind of make it all full picture for you. But yeah, I hopefully if you see any of these things in yourself, just know, first of all, that you're not alone, and second of all, that there's always a way to change it and better it. So,
and that it's not your fault.
And it's not your fault. Okay. Well, I love you, Dad.
Love you, honey.